Okay, so Chuck, we're here again, and we have this chance to talk about chapter 34 from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. The chapter is called Identity and Moral Agency by Professor Mikko Jurjon Suri. I'm not sure if I'm saying that well, but we've had a chance to introduce the material and come at from the outside looking in, perhaps.
This is Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Mikko Jurjon Suri's Chapter 34, Identity and Moral Agency, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
But now I think maybe we're in a position to actually start working through the text of the professor's theses and really just talk about some of the fundamental basics that the professor engages with here. And, before I would have read this chapter, Chuck, I would have thought that issues of human identity were largely Enlightenment era considerations, that maybe the medievals didn't think so much about this. But of course, I've found out that's far from true. And what was your thought here as you're going through the first section or two here with the professor's material?
What I found really interesting is that you're right. There is a particular way of thinking about identity, who we are as humans, that is unique to more modern philosophy. But that doesn't mean that these are not issues that have arisen all through history and all through all sorts of thinkers. And even though this chapter specifically talks about the medievals, it does reach back into ancient times. And how did Aristotle and how did Plato think about these issues as well? And there's also a sense in which you really recognize that those discussions, those medieval discussions, those ancient discussions about human identity, about moral agency, still have an impact on how we think today. We may not perhaps discuss them in quite the same terms as the medievals did, but they still have an impact. And that very question, for example, later in the chapter, there's a lot of discussion about the rational actor. At times, what is considered the moral act isn't necessarily 100% congruent with what a rational actor would do if they are really focused on their own well-being, and that there is a part of morality that goes beyond simply that rational acting in one's own interest. And even today, I think there are those kinds of discussions are still happening. Is it really about, are we really a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of individuals who act in our own individual self-interest? And does that somehow then lead to more of a corporate interest? Or is there something beyond that? And I was thinking about this even later in the chapter. They talk about how it may seem sometimes not in one's rational self-interest, for example, to fight for one's nation. And I was thinking about that in terms of what we're seeing in the news right now. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to a lot in the news about families who are in the Ukraine who are splitting up and making really decisions that really go against self-interest, right? Family who chooses to have their children leave on their own to go to Poland or Romania while the parents remain in Ukraine to fight the invaders, or a family that divides up and the father goes, they might be from Western Ukraine, from Lviv or someplace like that, where the war really has not been a big thing, but the father leaves the family and goes and fights on the front lines in places like Mariupol or Kharkiv. And that seems again to go against not only the self-interest, but maybe even the interest of the family, but there's this greater good. And you wonder a little bit how, I think a lot of Americans wonder a little bit how we would react in such a circumstance as that. And whether all of those situations, we may never face them in exactly that same way, they do bring about these questions of, is there a greater good than merely self-interest? Is there a greater good than merely rational thinking? And those are things that even modern, even postmodern people struggle with. So it was a good discussion to think of from the perspectives of the medievals.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck. It is such a striking contrast between a typical medieval treatment regarding identity, regarding moral agency, especially in the context of a presumption of a universal duty, a universal moral law that all people are obligated by. Now, of course, we have this as Christians. We have this concept because we have God as the moral lawgiver. He gives duties, and we as humans receive that law that he gives. And then it creates the reception, creates within us a duty to respond positively. And throughout the medieval period, that idea of an external authority to which all people are universally obligated was the very typical context and discussion. Then we have one aspect of the modern challenge, which pushes back on this idea of an objective moral duty that people have, and even in some cases push back on the idea of an objective moral lawgiver. And so, in the Christian ethic in the medieval ages, we have this idea that people have a duty to obey God. And so, any issues of rationality in the Christian sphere have to do with how would one rationally obey the law of God. But then we have this turn to the modern where issues of perspective are introduced, as well as ideas of an autonomous moral nature. In other words, people are free to discover, do, act. And if maybe some of the modern thinkers don't maybe go so far as to reject the moral lawgiver, it at least comes out that there's a great degree of autonomy in the human subject to choose, to perform, to act, to do at a level that the human subject evaluates. And so the professor here talks about some of the issues associated with morality, a moral perspective, in terms of asking the question, what is good for one's self? Is that the same thing as asking what is good morally in some objective or some external grounded way? And if we're going to answer that question, we have to first agree, what are we? The three core issues that the professor lists here. The first one is, what are we? And then secondly, the professor talks about morality being defined and guided by issues of self-control. And think of me having the capacity to do many things. But just because I have the capacity to do many things doesn't mean it's necessarily right or best for me to do those things. Chuck, I have the capacity to to take a long stick, take my knife and carve a sharp point in the end of that stick. And then I have the capacity to take that sharp point that I've just carved and stick it in my eye. So I have capacity, but clearly, in terms of self control, in terms of limiting what I do, that doesn't mean that capacity should express itself. And so that's the second issue the professor brings up there. And then finally, this becomes very interesting. The professor talks about the third discussion that he wants to consider, and this is this moral motivation for self sacrifice. So we just talked a moment ago about me poking myself in the eye with a pointed stick. And I hope nobody takes from this that I consider that to be a moral good. And yet, at the same point in time, we're faced with problems of moral motivation. Why should I do something? Now, there's a very clear imperative around direct and enumerated things that are prescriptively given by God. So, in other words, if God commands that I should hop on my left foot 3 times, there's something final about that, and there's something ultimate about that. But we see in the scriptures, God commands many things that are not nearly so innumerable. So, for example, in the creation account, God commands the first humans be fruitful and multiply. What does that mean? If you and I are one of the early descendants of our first human parents, and you have many offspring and I have no offspring, what happened there? We can look at the numbers and say one person was faithful to that mandate and another one wasn't. But maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe there are other issues here. And so, beyond just trying to enumerate a list of rules, morality, ethics, and responsiveness here is it's perspectival. In other words, the human perspective plays some role. Now, in Christianity, the human perspective plays a subordinate role to the divine will. And yet, it still plays some part. And when you're trying to sort all of these aspects out, what's a good way to bring order out of this chaos? Let me try to put it that way. How would you start to try to tame the complexity, get things under control here?
I'm not sure that on my own I would be able to come up with a good way to do that, but I do appreciate the structure that the professor here used. I think it does help us to think through these issues not only from medieval perspective, but even beyond. And these core issues of what are we, what does it mean to be human, those kinds of questions that to begin with really they're important questions. And they're questions that I don't know always get asked real well in our society today, or when we answer them without some background. We just jump to conclusions. And so I think that is a good question to begin with. And then those questions, I think, self-control and self-interest and rationality, I think using those three questions was really a helpful way to get at a number of the key issues. Now, I think there's probably some other things that we don't completely get to in that regard when we just limit ourselves to those three questions. But that process that the professor in this chapter used, I thought was really helpful and would be a good way to sometimes even, I think we have a tendency to jump to that last one and thinking about self-interest and rationality and what does that mean, but sometimes directing conversations back further. We're talking about self-interest, but where does self-control play a role in how we exercise our self-interest? And where does who we are? What does it mean to be a human being? How does that play a role in how we think of those things? One of the things I was thinking about a little bit as we were reading this chapter is I have an acquaintance who I don't think she would call herself an atheist, but functionally she is. She certainly has real problems with Christianity and sees Christianity as being more oppressive than anything, although there are times when she's occasionally given some grudging respect to what she calls real Christians, which to her are Christians who behave in a way that she approves of. But in some of the discussions that I've had with her because she'll often, as sometimes tends to happen, she doesn't engage with a lot of Christians in her life. And so I'm one of the few that she does. And then she'll say things like, well, I like you. You seem to be a good guy. I just don't get how can you find yourself, connecting with these Christians who do this oppressive stuff. And while she herself is not Native American, she has a lot of connections to the Native American community. And so one of her big issues is some of the things that happened in history with oppressing natives and a lot of the things that happened there. And how can you affiliate yourself with people who did that kind of stuff? And in the course of that discussion, we've often talked about this idea that perhaps there is more to being human than just simply individual self-interest. And she's admitted that, if we eliminate everything about being human other than that we are trying to do what's best for ourselves in this world, we would be in a lot of trouble. And she admits that there has to be something beyond that.